Hello everybody, welcome to May 2018. It's not May the 4th. I do know that many of you did celebrate Star Wars Day though, as it's been called. Personally, I consider Star Wars Day to be the day that Star Wars came out, May 25th. Anyway, last year of course was the 40th anniversary of Star Wars. Well, a lot of you may or may not know that this year is the 40th anniversary of Star Wars model kits. Now, reason for that is when Star Wars originally came out, not a lot of people knew that it was going to be as big a hit as it was. And so even prospective licensees of Star Wars products were kind of slow to embrace it. But there were some licenses that were signed just before the film came out. One of them was a license from Model Plastics Corporation, MPC. Now, Model Plastics Corporation was a member of the General Mills Fund Group back then, the big cereal company. And one of the other companies also owned by General Mills at the time was also Kenner. A lot of us are familiar with the history of the Star Wars toys and know that very few of those made it to market by the end of 1977. I mean, there were a few puzzles and stuff. The action figures didn't really start appearing until March now, thanks to that empty box display gambit that Kenner came up with. Wasn't really anything equivalent under MPC, so we had to wait until 1978 before the kits started appearing. First four kits that appeared, a big C-3PO kit, an R2-D2 kit, and then the X-Wing fighter and Darth Vader's TIE fighter. When the kits first appeared, they were issued in a large box like this one that you see here. A little bit later on, they were replaced by a box that was a little smaller, at least not quite as wide. Therefore, retail outlets, big box stores, hobby shops could put more on the shelf. And they sold very, very well. I mean, what kid back then didn't want a model or a toy of the X-Wing? I know I did. Of course, my model skills were not that great back in '77, given that I was only about 6 years old until November of that year. But I do remember building the C-3PO, and I did have the R2-D2 unit. This particular kit is one of the earliest examples I can find of an X-Wing that was issued in 1978. One of the ways I helped determine that was date coding on the decal sheets. This is an example here of a decal sheet from April, printed in April of 1978. Pretty much a lot of your decals back then do have that date coding. The one that's in this kit actually dates from March of '78. And the other thing you'll see too is that these earliest pressings of the X-Wing actually had a bit more brick red in the red coloring. The sheet right here, which is actually from the X-Wing kit that I built, dated December of '78, is a bit more orange in color. And over time, you can kind of see too that there's all sorts of interesting variations of red. Some are more orange than others. Other thing about it is too is the December one, it's actually got individual clear film around the markings. The very first one, the entire sheet is clear over the markings, so you pretty much had to trim them right up close if you wanted to use these. There are also foreign market X-Wings that were issued. Back then we didn't have companies with international agreements to issue all over the place, so pretty much for distributorship in different countries, MPC had to come up with their own marketing and their own partnerships. And in the case of the X-Wing and the Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, they even did slightly different tooling. This right here is an example of a Canadian issued X-Wing. And it's quite interesting. Where these were issued was not too far away from where MPC was based. MPC was based out of Michigan, but it looks like they engineered a unique tooling and actually trucked it all the way into Canada, Ontario, and started issuing them there. And the funny thing is the Canadian kit and most of the foreign kits that were released at the time, Denny's Fisher in the United Kingdom, Meccano in France, Harbert in Italy, and Kinner in Germany, actually had a unique tool kit that had raised panel lines. I could pull it out and show you, but it's very, very hard because these things are molded in white plastic. But believe me, the panel lines on this kit are raised, whereas the panel lines on the US issue kit are recessed. So that led to a little bit of confusion on the part of international modelers. I didn't even know a raised panel line X-Wing even existed until about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I saw one out. I bought this Canadian issue, and sure enough, there it was. They were right. Other unique thing about some of the foreign issues that I'll make mention of, stickers instead of decals. Peel and stick stickers. I know that Italian issue also had stickers, except they were kind of like a flat white printed paper type. These are like a Mylar. Don't know how good they are. Don't really plan to use them. And of course you've got dual language instructions. You've got English on one side and French on the other for the French Canadians. Pretty nice piece. I mean, this one's not all that much different from the US-based X-Wing. Okay. Maybe you can kind of see a little bit of difference in the plastic. This is the US-based one with recessed panel lines. This is the Canadian one, foreign market one as I like to call it, with the raised panel lines. Very petite. Very, very similar. So, and there's even a little bit more detail on the raised panel lines. They give you some of the small panels on the outside of these big cover ports on the side. Plus they even give you these little round sockets in the fuselage, which were a nice detail. Turns out those were power ports for the lighting systems and the operating wing mechanisms. Very, very interesting how they did that. But yeah, this one represents it. The recessed panel line version does not. But these were released side by side. This one in the US, this one in the foreign markets. So no, this did not replace this one. Although later on it did. For instance, Japanese issued X-Wing kits done from the MPC mold. Those were done in recessed panel line, but of course the Japanese issue of Star Wars didn't come out until rather late in the game, in the early 1978 as I recall, mainly because of the sound mixing and dubbing required as I understand it. Yep, so here we have some of the prime parts of a standard X-Wing kit. You've got upper and lower fuselage, the wings. This is not all the parts naturally. Cockpit, pilot figure. Detailing was pretty good for the time. I mean, there is evidence that MPC did obviously have access to at least photographs of the studio models. They may have had access to a standard studio model themselves, but there are some differences that seem to indicate that maybe, maybe not. But they got major details there. They got these cover pieces on the side of the fuselage, which turned out to be covers for the animation rods that were used for filming. Same thing with the bottom hatch on the bottom of the fuselage, and then on the top, they may have gone through where the R2-D2 unit was, because it does correspond almost exactly where that cover would need to be. And then there was another cover on the back of the fuselage. Detailing, relatively good. I mean, this was as good as it was back in 1978. A lot of modelers have a love-hate relationship with it. I mean, it's kind of like the original Starship Enterprise from AMT, the 18-inch long kit. A lot of it is, this is like one of the first kits that we cut our teeth on. But at the same time, too, we kind of hope for something better to come along. And, well, better kits did come along in the 1990s and then 2000 when Fine Molds did their stuff. But there's still something to me that's kind of special about the original MPC kit. Now, before some of you say, Jay, that's like polishing a turd, I will submit to you that with model skill and creativity, this model could easily become the best X-Wing in your collection, and utilizing some of that model skill yourself, you'll have a prouder effort when you do it, because you'll actually be building something, fixing the problems, and not just assembling a kit. Even though, well, I do realize we do all have different skill sets and stuff. If you're a raw beginner, I wouldn't recommend starting on one of these unless you're just going to do it out of the box build. If you're intermediate to advanced, you can have a lot of fun with this kit. I mean, fun can be relative, I do admit. This is a 40-year-old model kit, obviously, but give me a moment and I'll show you what I was able to do with one of these. My friends, I give you the MPC X-Wing in all its glory. This has been built to represent Red Leader from the first film, and a lot of work went into this. Here you can see the detail on the fuselage and the wings in all its glory. Let's look at the bottom here. One of the biggest complaints about the MPC kit has to do with the lower fuselage profile, because there's kind of a bit of a kink where it goes up before it goes into that downward slant on the fuselage. A lot of people don't like that feature. I don't like it. Technically that feature is canon though, because for Empire Strikes Back they actually built one or two MPC X-Wings for fleet scenes, and you can barely see them in the sequence where where there's two X-Wings escorting a transport before they fire the ion cannon to disable a Star Destroyer out of the way. There's so far, it's really hard to make out all the details though, but the kink is there. I've actually seen pictures of one of them at auction. But what I did here to fix that was I used a piece from a second X-Wing, blended it in, sanded it really well, and blended the back here with two-part epoxy putty, Abe's epoxy sculpt, to get it to blend in properly, and, well, you can't see the kink. The advantage of doing that is, you know, the later production X-Wings are very, very plentiful. The parts have the same dimensions, and no changes were made to the molds, so it was a relatively easy fix to do. It just took a fair amount of blending. It didn't happen overnight, obviously, but as you can see, the lower fuselage profile looks a lot better. If you look towards the proton torpedo ports, you can see they're a lot more recessed than they are in the original kit. What I did there was I basically ground them out with a Dremel rotary tool, and then did some additional cutting and sanding. And I took a piece of brass tubing of the approximate diameter, mashed some two-part epoxy putty into the backside, and then mashed the tube in there until I got the shape I wanted, and basically twirled it, and I waited for the putty to set up, and it did the job really nice. Beauty of two-part epoxy putties is a lot of them basically can be molded like clay, and the longer they sit, the more hard they get, so they develop some nice resistance, so that worked out pretty well. Canopy, a lot of work there. This is actually the original kit canopy that I used, but the front divider, it extends a bit too far up. It's supposed to come a lot further down the nose, so I basically ground that off, sanded it really fine, then I built it up with strip styrene. Strip styrene was also used on the sides to reprofile the sides of the canopy, and then I also even Did some reprofiling on the fuselage and the canopy to actually get that little raised up section, because the original one just basically goes towards the front and then it takes off about 90 degrees up to the front end, and that doesn't look right. So a lot of work it took to blend that, but as you can see, it looks pretty good. You know, the inner wings, don't know how well you can see it, but I've added some additional detail in there as well. For instance, there's like this little detail piece on the upper wing. From my donor X-Wing kit, I actually cut these little sections off of the wings of the donor X-Wing kit and ground them down, and basically applied them to the inner wing openings back here. Sheet styrene was also used to reprofile the holes, because the original holes seem to be a little bit too big. They're not exactly the right shape. I originally started work on this guy a few years ago and I put it away. When I brought it back out, I did make some modifications to make it a little bit better, a little bit more accurate. But there were some areas that, well, if I had done it from the ground up, I probably could have made these inner wing openings a little bit better. But at the same time too, I wanted to preserve some of the unique features found on the MPC model kit. Now, one feature that is obviously not from an MPC model kit are the outer engine pods, both top and bottom. You can see these look a lot better than what the MPC kit has if you have an MPC kit. But if you really want to know what those are actually the styrene molded outer engine pods intended for the Estes X-Wing model rocket. Not the Maxi Brute, but the standard one. The Maxi Brute actually, which was studio model scale, the Maxi Brute actually had cardboard wraps going on body tubes to cut the weight down. But they actually used styrene pieces on the Estes kit, and they actually did a very good job molding these details, even though the fuselage on the Estes kit is obviously more bloated. You didn't really have that kink. The fuselage was a lot wider going to the nose cone, simply because it needed a body tube to go through it for the rocket engine and for the parachute to allow for it to fly stable. It was kind of a bit of serendipity finding out that these would work. I had already modified the engines on the original. Did a reasonable good job, I thought, but then I compared them to these, and it turned out the diameter was pretty much bang on, and the length was only off by about 1 millimeter back here. I said, Jay, what you just found means you're going to really be upset if you wipe out your work and this doesn't work. Well, 8 hours later, I had a full set of Estes X-Wing engine pods. I had to do some modifications to get them to incorporate with the front of the engine faces, but it did the job. As you can see, I'm pretty happy with the results. Let's focus on the cockpit for a little bit. The pilot figure actually is the original pilot figure from the MPC kit. A lot of people were not too crazy about it, mainly because the pilot, okay, it had an open face helmet. It looked like he was wearing like some form of head injury headgear, or like a motorcycle helmet that was really too tight to fit properly. I did have a resin conversion cockpit and pilot figure, and from that I have used the cockpit and the droid. These were mastered by a friend of mine by the name of Chris Dahl, who did sell these for about $10 about 10 years ago at one of the Wonderfest conventions. They're long gone, you can't get them anymore. And he basically modified the kit pilot, cockpit, and R2 unit to something that looked more accurate, something that was more like what you actually saw on the full-size set rather than in the studio model. Well, in my case, I wanted to tried to use the original pilot figure if at all possible, and I had images of a helmet design that Joe Johnson actually had come up with and submitted to George Lucas for possible use on the full-size helmets. They eventually went with those open visor helmets that were modified from U.S. and British military spec pilots' helmets. But I like that full-face helmet look so much that I pretty much put some 2-part epoxy putty on there and got it to the right shape. Use a little bit of styrene to shape the things, and basically it looks like a helmet you might find on a, well, worn by, like a full-face helmet worn by a race car driver, but it's a little slicker. Pretty happy with how the results turned out. I had some pretty good references for that. The R2 unit had a better looking dome. The markings for this one represent red leader, and so I actually found images to show that red leader during production actually had a red R2 dome with white panels. Later on, it looks like they used a white R2 mech in there for publicity photos, but near as I can tell, red was what was actually used during the production. Doesn't match, of course, the R5 astromech that you saw in the full-size set, but I was doing something that looked like a studio model, so that wasn't really that critical. As you can see, there's a lot of paneling that I've added to the model in various spots. All the weathering on here that you see and all the paint work, that is all based on images that I found of the Red Leader Studio model to the best of my ability. In some cases I had to guess, like some of the panel locations on the underside. Other thing I made a conscious decision on is one image that I found of the Red Leader, I believe the Pyro model, showed this area was a lot blacker. I think maybe they were trying to represent the bottom of the nose after he dropped the proton torpedoes and they just blew up on the surface. Who knows? The full Hero model didn't seem to be as dark. It is darker than what I ended up with, but I do have a noticeable tan line right here, so I'm happy with how it turned out. Pastel chalk weathering was used whenever possible, and I like the results. You know, some of you might be wondering about my really handy-dandy animation rod stand here. Obviously, this is not the stock display stand that the kit comes with. What I essentially did was I used a display trophy plaque base, which I got from a local trophy shop. Drilled a hole in the back. This is acrylic rod going up, which I used a heat gun to bend. And inside that, I've actually got a brass tube, which nests into another brass tube that I actually mounted inside the main pivot junction for the S foils. Yes, I did keep the pivot function intact so I can close the wings if I need to for transport. It did result in a little bit of misalignment issues with the guns on the wings, but you know, it was a compromise I was willing to accept. But the beauty of this is I can display it any way I need to, and theoretically if I take it to a contest I can even instruct the judges, hey, you want to look at the underside? Just flip the model over, there you go, look at the underside. It hasn't won any contests yet, at least not on the IPMS level, probably because there's still some minor alignment issues with the wings and the guns, but you know, I'm still very happy with the work because I like to build for what I enjoy building, and I'm not really necessarily too worried with what they think at contests, although we'll see how it does at Wonderfest. Hopefully it'll do pretty well there. One other feature I'll point out is when I transport this model, I've actually created basically a little hatch plug for the back. So if I wanted to, I can take this model off, put the hatch plug there, like if I wanted to use some sort of a different stand possibly. But so I've got this is basically one of the locations for the animation rod on the real studio model, and then the final animation rod point was on the nose. So yeah, nice little bit of unique movie history there that I can incorporate. Here we are looking at it from the other side. Strip styrene was used to do panels on the nose, and I basically got every reference photo I could find of the Red Leader Studio model. There's probably not one major subassembly on this model that hasn't been modified too much, with the possible exception of the engines back here, but even then I did some minor work. I mean, the guns are made out of a combination of telescopic brass tubing and styrene tubing. The gun shields on the front, those actually come from the SD's X-Wing as well, because I like the diameter of these. They were a little bit larger. I could have scratch built them, and then I've also got brass tubing used for the gun tips, and they're even open. Paint chipping, that was done with a Dremel Moto tool. Basic colors that I used were, the basic hull color is Tamiya AS20 US Navy Insignia White. Yes, it is a white shade, but it's more closer to like a camouflage gray, but with about 30% white added to it. I liked it. It's a good general hull color. Comes only in a spray can. I wish it would come in a brush version so I could airbrush it. I know you can decant, but decanting is kind of messy in my opinion. Flat white for the nose. Insignia red. I used an acrylic insignia red, mainly so I could use an engraving tip on my Dremel to actually do all this paint chipping. Black fine line pen was used in several areas. Pastel chalk weathering on the wings. All this detail matches what the studio models had. Major paint work, major insignia work was painted on. I did not use any decals except for the little tiny black hash marks that you see on the fuselage. And those came from various decal sets. Well, in any event, I guess I better wrap this up and just say and conclude that if you want to do a project like this, it's possible. This goes to show that even a 40-year-old X-Wing model can be brought into the 21st century easily with just some simple skill. I was very impressed with how this model turned out, and I hope you are too. Thank you for watching.